A ruthless London gangster marries a girl to settle a £200,000 debt, convinced she's a pawn used by her father many times before. He treats her with cold brutality on their wedding night, only to discover a shattering truth. She was a pure, untouched virgin. Now, consumed by guilt and a protective fire, he must choose between the empire he built on blood and the innocent soul he accidentally broke. As his enemies realize, the Iron King finally has a weakness. The rain in London on October 12, 1994, was not merely weather. It was a persistent cold weight that clung to the soot-stained bricks of the East End. It was the kind of dampness that seeped through the most expensive wool coats and settled into the marrow of a man's bones. Elias sat in the back of his black sedan, watching the droplets race down the window pane like tears on a face that had forgotten how to cry. He was 35 years old, but his eyes, dark and impenetrable as the Thames at midnight, held the weariness of a century. He smoothed the fabric of his trousers, his large, calloused hands a stark contrast to the refined silk of his suit. Those hands had built an empire out of shadows and silence, and tonight they were here to collect what was owed. The car came to a halt outside a crumbling warehouse near the docks. The architecture here was a graveyard of industrial ambition, skeletal iron beams reaching toward a sky that refused to offer any light. Elias stepped out, the click of his leather soles echoing against the wet cobblestones. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a threat, a localized storm that commanded the air around him. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco and desperation. Julian was waiting for him, hunched over a scarred wooden desk that looked ready to collapse under the weight of his own failures. Julian had been a middleman for years, a man who moved goods and information, but he had grown greedy and, worse, careless. He owed Elias £200,000, a sum that might as well have been $2 million given the empty state of Julian's accounts. "Elias," Julian stammered, his voice thin and reedy. He didn't stand. He couldn't. His knees were shaking visibly beneath the desk. "I know why you're here. I need more time. The shipment from the coast, it was seized. I can make it up to you, I swear on my life." Elias didn't respond immediately. He walked to the center of the room, his gaze roaming over the peeling wallpaper and the stacks of empty crates. He took a slow, deliberate breath, let it out, and then turned his eyes toward the trembling man. "I don't deal in swears, Julian," Elias said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in the small space. "And I certainly don't deal in your life. Your life is worth nothing to me. It doesn't pay the men who guard my perimeter, and it doesn't fill the holes you've left in my ledger. You've had 3 extensions. This was the final one." Julian's face turned a sickly shade of grey. He reached into his pocket with a fumbling hand and pulled out a small, wrinkled photograph, sliding it across the desk as if it were a winning lottery ticket. Elias approached the desk, his movements fluid and predatory. He looked down at the image. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 21. She had hair the color of spun copper and eyes that seemed to hold a haunting, quiet depth even through the grainy quality of the print. She wasn't smiling, but there was a dignity in her expression that felt entirely out of place in a room like this. "My daughter," Julian whispered, his eyes darting toward Elias's face, searching for a spark of interest. "Clara. She's pure, Elias. Untouched. She's the only thing of value I have left. I know you've been looking for a way to legitimize your standing, to have a wife that brings a certain image to your table. Take her. Marry her. The debt is wiped clean, and you have a beauty at your side that no amount of stolen gold could buy." Elias felt a cold, sharp spike of cynicism pierce through him. He had known many women, women who traded their bodies for power, women who were as sharp and dangerous as the knives he kept in his desk drawer. He viewed them as assets or distractions, never as partners. To him, loyalty was a myth, and innocence was a commodity that was usually sold long before it reached his doorstep. He assumed Clara was just like the rest, a girl who had likely been coached by her father to play the part of the sacrificial lamb. He leaned forward, his hands bracing on the desk, bringing his face inches from Julian's. The scent of Julian's fear was pungent, metallic. "You're selling your own blood to pay for your mistakes," Elias remarked, his tone devoid of judgment but heavy with contempt. "Does she know what kind of man I am? Does she know she's being traded for a ledger entry?" "She does what she's told," Julian said, his desperation overriding any lingering sense of fatherly instinct. "She's a good girl, quiet. She won't cause you any trouble. Please, Elias, it's the only way." Elias looked back at the photograph. There was something about the curve of her neck, the way her shoulders were set in that frozen moment of time, that stirred a dark, buried curiosity within him. He didn't believe in the purity Julian spoke of. In his world, everyone had a price and everyone had a secret, but the idea of owning something so seemingly fragile appealed to his sense of dominance. It was a business transaction, pure and simple. A wife was a social requirement he had ignored for too long, and if she was as compliant as her father claimed, she would be a useful addition to his estate. "1 week," Elias said, standing up straight and adjusting his cuffs. "I want the ceremony private. No press, no outside noise. We sign the papers, the debt is settled, and she belongs to me. If I find out you've hidden anything from me, any other debts, any other lovers she's tucked away, I will come back for the interest, Julian, and the interest will be paid in skin." Julian nodded frantically, tears of relief finally spilling over. Elias didn't wait for a thank you. He turned and walked back out into the London rain. The image of the girl with the copper hair burned into the back of his mind. As he slid back into the warmth of his car, he felt a strange, unfamiliar heat beneath his skin. It wasn't love. He didn't believe in such things, but it was a primal anticipation. He imagined the moment he would first touch her, the way her skin might feel against his rough palms. He expected her to be cold, perhaps rehearsed in her affections, ready to play the role of the mobster's wife for a comfortable life. He had no idea that behind the heavy oak doors of Julian's home, Clara was sitting in a darkened room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had heard the whispers. She knew the name Elias. To her, he wasn't a savior or a businessman. He was the shadow that was about to swallow her whole. As the car pulled away, the flickering streetlights of the city cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement. The deal was struck. The blood debt was moved from the ledger to the altar, and the gears of a transformation neither of them could foresee began to grind into motion. Elias closed his eyes, the silence of the car amplifying the steady beat of his own heart, unaware that the girl in the photograph was about to dismantle every wall he had ever built. The morning of October 13th, 1994, arrived with a pale, anemic sun that struggled to pierce the thick fog rolling off the marshes. In his sprawling estate in North London, a house of glass, steel and cold marble that felt more like a fortress than a home, Elias began his day exactly as he had for the last 15 years. There was no room for deviation in a life built on the razor's edge of survival. Discipline was the only thing that kept the chaos of the streets from swallowing a man whole. He stood in the center of his private gym, the rhythmic thud of his bare feet against the mats the only sound in the cavernous space. He was shirtless, his torso a map of a violent history. Scars from blades and bullets crisscrossed his tanned skin, silver reminders of the times he had nearly lost everything. His muscles were lean and functional, forged through thousands of hours of repetitive, grueling effort. He didn't train for vanity. He trained so that when the moment came to exert his will, his body would not fail him. As he moved through a series of high-intensity strikes against a heavy leather bag, his mind drifted back to the warehouse. He could still smell the damp rot of Julian's desperation. The memory of the girl's photograph flickered in his mind like a persistent ghost. Clara. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound that was lost in the silence. He had seen her type 1,000 times. In his world, innocence was a mask worn by those who wanted to survive long enough to find a better benefactor. He was certain Julian had used her before, perhaps to soften a deal or to distract a rival. The idea that she was untouched was a fairy tale told by a man who had nothing left to sell but lies. To Elias, Clara was a pawn, a piece of property that had been moved across a board to settle a debt. He felt a flicker of annoyance at the necessity of the marriage, but he understood the strategic value. The higher tiers of London's elite, the ones who controlled the banks and the docks, liked their associates to have the veneer of respectability. A wife, A beautiful woman at his side would serve as a shield, a way to blend into the light, while his business remained firmly rooted in the dark. After his workout, Elias stepped into the shower. The water was scalding, turning his skin a dark, flushed red. He leaned his forehead against the cold tiles, letting the heat work into his tight shoulders. He thought about the physical reality of the wedding night. He imagined Clara would be brittle, perhaps rehearsed in her submission, her eyes already calculating the value of the jewelry he would inevitably provide. He would be firm with her. He would set the rules from the start. She would have luxury, security, and his protection, but she would never have his trust. He stepped out and dried himself, the heavy towel abrasive against his skin. He moved to his dressing room, a space filled with rows of bespoke suits, each one tailored to hide the lines of a holster and the tension of a predator. He selected a charcoal grey three-piece suit. As he dressed, his movements were slow and deliberate. He liked the weight of the silk against his chest, the way the waistcoat hugged his frame. The act of dressing was his ritual of transformation. It was the armor he wore to face the world. A knock at the door broke his concentration. "Come," Elias said. Marcus entered. He was a man of 40 with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of granite. He had been Elias's right hand since they were teenagers running errands in the East End. Marcus was the only person in London who could look Elias in the eye without flinching. "The arrangements are being made," Marcus said, his voice a low grate. "The registrar will be at the estate on November 20th. The paperwork is ready for Julian to sign. But the men are talking, Elias. They don't understand why you're taking a girl from a man who failed us. It looks like a gift." Elias turned to face his friend, his expression unreadable. He reached for a silver watch on the dresser, winding it with practiced ease. "It's not a gift, Marcus, it's an acquisition. Julian owes me £200,000. By taking his daughter, I ensure he stays under my thumb for the rest of his life. Every time he thinks about crossing me, he'll remember that I own his legacy. Besides, I need a wife. It's time I stopped being the man who takes what he wants and started being the man who keeps what he has." Marcus leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "And the girl, what if she's a problem? Julian's blood is weak. She might have his streak of treachery." Elias adjusted his tie, ensuring the knot was perfectly centered. "She's 21 years old, Marcus. She's been raised by a man who would sell his soul for a week's grace. She knows the game. She'll play her part because she has no other choice. If she tries to be clever, I'll deal with her the same way I deal with any other asset that stops being profitable." He walked past Marcus, the scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and black pepper lingering in the air. They headed down the grand staircase to the dining hall, where a breakfast of black coffee and dry toast was waiting. Elias didn't eat for pleasure, he ate for fuel. "I want her moved to the guest wing on the 19th, Elias ordered as he sat at the head of the long mahogany table. "I want her checked for bugs, and I want her belongings searched. I don't want any surprises when she enters this house." "Consider it done," Marcus replied. "But Elias, what if the old man was telling the truth? What if she really is as innocent as he claimed?" Elias paused, the coffee cup halfway to his lips. He let out a cold, hollow laugh. "In London, in 1994, innocence is a luxury for the dead, Marcus. Everyone has a price. Everyone has been used. She's just a girl who's been traded to a better master. She'll realize that soon enough." As he looked out the window at the grey, rain-slicked gardens, Elias felt a strange, tight sensation in his chest. It wasn't anxiety, he didn't suffer from that, but it was an awareness. For the first time in his life, he was bringing someone into his inner sanctum. He convinced himself it was merely a change in logistics, a new piece of furniture to be managed. He had no way of knowing that Clara, at that very moment, was standing in her small bedroom in her father's house, looking at a white dress she hated, her heart filled with a terrifying, silent resolve. She wasn't the pawn he expected. She wasn't the used-up girl Julian had described. She was a storm of her own, waiting for the right moment to break. And Elias, for all his intelligence and power, was walking blindly into a collision that would leave his carefully constructed world in ruins. He finished his coffee, stood up, and prepared to spend the rest of the day enforcing his will on the city, unaware that the real challenge to his authority was already waiting for him in the shadow of a wedding veil. On October 25, 1994, the air inside the narrow townhouse felt like it had been held in a lung for too long, stale, heavy, and tasting of dust. Clara sat by the window of her third-floor bedroom, her forehead pressed against the cold glass. From this height, the city was a blur of charcoal-grey rooftops and thin ribbons of yellow light from the street lamps. She watched the people below, huddled under umbrellas, hurrying toward warm kitchens and familiar voices. To them, she was just a shadow behind a curtain. To her father, she was the final card in a losing hand. Clara was 21, though she felt as though she had lived a century within these four walls. Her beauty was of a rare, quiet sort, the kind that didn't demand attention but commanded it once noticed. Her hair, the color of a copper penny caught in the sun, fell in heavy waves down to the small of her back. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, revealing the delicate blue architecture of her veins at her wrists and temples. But it was her eyes that held the most power. They were a deep, mossy green, observant, and filled with a resilience that her father had never bothered to look for. She had been raised in a gilded cage, though the gold had long since chipped away to reveal the rusted iron beneath. Julian had kept her sheltered, not out of a sense of protective love, but because of a toxic blend of shame and greed. He had seen her purity as a vault, a reserve of value to be tapped into only when his own world was collapsing. She had been taught to speak softly, to walk with grace, and to never ever ask questions about the men who came and went from the downstairs study. A floorboard creaked behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew the heavy, uneven step of her father. "The dress arrived," Julian said, his voice thick with the false cheer of a man who had sold his conscience. "It's silk, Italian, only the best for my little girl." Clara finally turned, her gaze landing on the white garment draped over a chair. It looked like a shroud. "You didn't buy this for me, Father. You bought it to ensure the man you sold me to feels he's getting a premium product." Julian flinched, his eyes darting away. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago, the skin beneath his eyes sagging like wet parchment. "Elias is a powerful man, Clara. He can give you things I never could. Security, a name that people fear. You'll live in a palace." "I'll live in a fortress," she corrected him, her voice steady. "And I'll be expected to warm the bed of a man whose hands are stained with the blood of half of London. Did you tell him I've never even been to a dance? Did you tell him I've spent my life reading books and looking out this window because you were too afraid I'd see what you really are?" Julian stepped forward, a flash of his old temper sparking in his eyes, but it died out quickly, replaced by a hollow desperation. "It's done, Clara. The papers are signed. On the 20th of next month, you become his. If you refuse, if you make this difficult, he'll kill me. Do you understand? He'll take this house and he'll leave me in the gutter." Clara looked at her father, the man who should have been her protector, and felt a profound sense of pity that overrode her fear. "I won't refuse. I've lived my life according to your debts, Father. This will be the last one I pay for you." When he left the room, the silence that followed was even heavier. Clara walked over to the dress. She ran her fingers over the silk. It was cool and dangerously smooth like the surface of a frozen lake. She imagined the man who had bought it. Elias. The name was whispered in the markets like a curse. She had heard the stories, the silent executions, the ruthless takeovers, the way he moved through the city like a predatory cat. She expected a monster. She expected a man of iron and ice who would break her simply because he could. She stripped off her simple cotton nightgown and stood before the full-length mirror. The room was cold, and her skin erupted in goosebumps. She began to brush her hair, the rhythmic strokes the only thing keeping her grounded. She looked at her reflection, trying to see what Elias would see. She saw a girl who was fragile in appearance, but made of something much harder beneath the surface. Her father thought he was selling a lamb to a wolf, but Clara had spent years learning how to hide her thoughts, how to observe, and how to wait. As she brushed, she thought about the physical reality of what was coming. She knew so little of men. Her contact with the opposite sex had been limited to the brief, terrifying glances of her father's associates. The thought of a man like Elias touching her, of his large, scarred hands against her skin, sent a shiver through her that wasn't entirely born of fear. It was a dark, terrifying heat, a curiosity about the world of the senses that had been denied to her for so long. She reached for a small bottle of rose oil on her vanity, a gift from a mother she barely remembered. She uncorked it and pressed a drop to the pulse point at her neck, then to the inside of her wrists. The scent was faint, a memory of a garden in a city of concrete. She closed her eyes, imagining the weight of a suit jacket over her shoulders, the scent of sandalwood and black pepper she had heard the maids whisper about when they discussed the man who visited Julian. She wasn't just preparing for a wedding, she was preparing for a war. She knew that in Elias's house her only weapon would be her mind, and perhaps the very innocence they all seemed to value so much. She didn't know what it meant to be a wife, but she knew what it meant to be a survivor. She walked back to the window. The rain had started again, a soft tapping against the glass. Somewhere out there, in a house of marble and steel, Elias was waiting for her. He thought he was buying a submissive bride to clean his image. He thought he was getting a girl who would tremble at his footfall. Clara placed her hand against the glass, right over the reflection of her own heart. She felt it beating, slow, steady, and defiant. She would go to him. She would wear his silk and his diamonds. She would stand by his side as the city watched. But she would not be broken. The days between now and the 20th felt like a countdown to an execution, yet Clara found herself wishing for the time to move faster. The tension in her father's house was suffocating, a slow-motion collapse of everything she had ever known. She began to pack her few belongings, mostly books with worn covers and a few sketches she had made of the view from her window. As she tucked a charcoal drawing of a lonely bird into her trunk, she felt a sudden, sharp pang of realization. When she left this room, she would never be this version of Clara again. The girl who watched the world from a tower was about to be cast into the fire. She looked at the white dress one last time, the fabric shimmering in the moonlight, looking like a ghost waiting to be filled. The loop was tightening, the debt was calling, and as the clock struck midnight, the first step toward her new life was already being taken in the shadows of the streets below. November 20th, 1994, dawned with a sky the color of a bruised plum. A relentless, fine mist hung over the city, turning the grand architecture of Elias's estate into a haunting silhouette against the horizon. Inside the house, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and floor wax, a sterile, perfumed mask for the transaction about to take place. This was not a day for celebration. It was a day for the finalization of a contract. Elias stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, watching the rain dance across the manicured lawn. He was dressed in a black tuxedo so dark it seemed to absorb the meager light of the morning. His shirt was a crisp, startling white, and his cufflinks were simple bands of onyx. He looked every bit the master of his domain, refined, dangerous, and utterly composed. Yet, beneath the layers of wool and silk, his pulse was a steady, heavy drum. He found himself checking his silver watch every 10 minutes, an uncharacteristic display of impatience. "The registrar is here," Marcus said, appearing in the doorway. He looked uncomfortable in his formal attire, his broad shoulders straining against the seams of his jacket. "And Julian has arrived. He brought the girl." Elias didn't turn around immediately. He watched a single drop of water trail down the glass. "Is she ready?" "She looks like a ghost," Marcus replied bluntly. "But she's holding her head high. I'll give her that. She didn't cry when they pulled up." Elias finally turned, his expression a mask of granite. "Let's get this over with." The ceremony was held in the grand conservatory, a structure of glass and wrought iron that usually overflowed with exotic ferns and flowers. Today, however, it felt cold. The rain drummed a frantic, irregular rhythm against the glass roof, creating an acoustic barrier that isolated them from the rest of the world. There were no guests, only the essential witnesses, Marcus, Julian, and the registrar, a thin, nervous man who seemed to understand that his safety depended on his silence. Elias stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back. When the doors at the far end of the room opened, he felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. Clara walked toward him, her father's hand heavy on her arm. The white silk dress moved around her like liquid moonlight, shimmering with every step. The veil was sheer, a delicate mist that partially obscured her face, but Elias could see the fire of her hair beneath it. She looked fragile, almost ethereal, but as she drew closer, he saw the set of her jaw. She wasn't trembling. Julian's hand was shaking as he handed her over. He didn't look at Elias, he looked at the floor, the shame of his betrayal finally weighing on him in the presence of the man he feared most. Elias took Clara's hand. Her skin was ice-cold, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from his own palms. For a fraction of a second their eyes met. Elias expected to see terror, or perhaps the practiced submission of a girl who knew her worth was being traded. Instead, he saw a deep, defiant green that seemed to challenge the very air he breathed. The registrar began to speak, his voice a droning monotone that struggled to compete with the sound of the rain. The words were the standard vows of the United Kingdom, promises of honor, cherishing, and fidelity, but in this room they rang hollow. Elias spoke his parts in a low, resonant growl, his gaze never leaving Clara's face. He felt a strange, primal pull as he watched her lips move, reciting the words that legally bound her life to his. "The ring," the registrar whispered. Marcus handed Elias a band of solid platinum, encrusted with small, perfect diamonds. Elias took Clara's left hand. He felt the delicacy of her fingers, the way her bones seemed as light as a bird's. As he slid the ring onto her finger, he didn't just place it. He gripped her hand, his thumb brushing against the soft skin of her palm. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through him that was entirely unexpected. It was a possessive, heavy heat that settled in his gut. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the registrar concluded, his voice trembling slightly. "You may seal the vows." Elias stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. He reached out and lifted the veil. Up close, Clara was even more breathtaking. The rose oil she had used was faint, a whisper of a garden in the middle of a storm. Her lips were pale, parted slightly as she breathed. Elias didn't offer a gentle kiss. He leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers with a firm, territorial pressure. It was a claim, a marking of territory. Her lips were soft, yielding but not responding, and for a heartbeat he felt the frantic pulse at her throat beneath his fingertips. The ceremony ended as abruptly as it had begun. Julian signed the registry with a fumbling hand, his eyes darting toward the door as if he couldn't wait to escape the reality of what he had done. Elias signed with a bold, steady script, the ink drying black and permanent on the page. "The car is waiting for your father, Clara," Elias said, his voice cold and flat as he turned to his new wife. He didn't use her name with affection. He used it like a label on a crate. Julian approached them, his face a mask of false regret. "Clara, be a good wife. Remember what we discussed." Clara didn't look at him. She looked at the ring on her finger, as if it were a shackle. "Goodbye, father. I hope the price was worth it." As Julian hurried out into the rain, leaving the estate in a cloud of exhaust and gravel, a heavy silence descended upon the conservatory. The registrar and Marcus retreated, leaving the newlyweds alone in the glass room. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the world outside into a grey, blurred abyss. Elias stood a few feet away from Clara, watching the way the light caught the copper of her hair. He felt a surge of triumph, the dark satisfaction of a man who had successfully acquired a rare and beautiful asset. But beneath that, there was a growing, restless hunger. He thought about the hours ahead, the evening meal they would share in silence, and the wedding night that would follow. "You'll be moved to the master suite," Elias stated. His tone brooked no argument. "My housekeeper has prepared everything. You have 3 hours to rest. I expect you at dinner by 7. Clara finally looked at him, her green eyes sharp and clear. "Am I allowed to speak in this house, or am I merely here to be looked at?" Elias felt a flash of surprise at her boldness. He took a step toward her, his presence looming over her smaller frame. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he settled it firmly on her shoulder. He could feel the tension in her muscles, the way she refused to flinch, even as his fingers dug slightly into the silk of her dress. "You may speak when you have something worth saying," Elias replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate silkiness. But for today, silence is your best ally. You've entered a world you don't understand, Clara. I suggest you learn the rules before you try to change them. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. Go to your room. Prepare yourself. Tonight, the debt is truly settled. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, leaving Clara standing alone in the center of the cold glass room. She watched him go, her hand tightening around the bouquet of white roses she still held. She felt the thorns through the silk ribbon, a small sharp pain that reminded her she was still alive. The house felt like it was closing in on her, a labyrinth of luxury and secrets. She looked up at the grey sky through the glass roof, wondering if she would ever see the sun again. The loop of her old life had been cut, and the new one was tightening around her throat like a silken cord. As the clock in the hallway struck 4, the countdown to the night began, and the air in the estate grew even heavier with the promise of a revelation that neither of them was prepared for. The clock in the grand hallway struck 12 midnight on November 20th, 1994. Inside the master suite of the estate, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of burning cedar and the faint, lingering trail of Clara's rose oil. The room was a sanctuary of shadows, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace, and a few strategically placed lamps that cast a warm amber glow over the velvet curtains and the vast, silk-covered bed. Outside, the London rain continued its relentless assault, a muffled drumming that seemed to isolate this room from the rest of the world. Elias stood by the window, his back to the room. He had removed his tuxedo jacket and waistcoat, leaving him in his white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful, scarred forearms that had carved his path through the city's underworld. He had spent the last 3 hours in a state of restless agitation, fueled by a dark, predatory anticipation. He had married a debt, but tonight he intended to claim the interest. He heard the soft rustle of silk behind him. Clara had emerged from the dressing room. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took her in. She was wearing a floor-length nightgown of cream-colored silk that clung to the curves of her body like a second skin. Her copper hair had been brushed out, falling in a shimmering cascade over her shoulders, reaching down to her waist. She looked impossibly young, her pale skin glowing in the firelight. She was standing by the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles white. "You look like you're waiting for an executioner," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration in the quiet room. Clara didn't look away. Her green eyes were wide, the pupils dilated, but she remained motionless. "Isn't that what this is? My father settled his accounts. Now you've come to collect." Elias crossed the room with the slow, deliberate grace of a hunter. He stopped just inches from her, his sheer physical presence looming over her. The heat radiating from him was intense, a sharp contrast to the cool air of the room. He reached out, his large hand capturing a lock of her hair. He felt the silkiness of the strands against his rough skin, a sensation that sent a jolt of hunger through his gut. "I didn't pay £200,000 for a statue, Clara," he whispered, his breath warm against her forehead. "I paid for a wife. I expected you to be prepared for this." He leaned down, his mouth grazing the sensitive skin of her neck. He felt her entire body shudder, a frantic, rhythmic trembling that he dismissed as mere nerves. He had dealt with many women who played at being shy to entice him, and he assumed Clara was simply performing her role with more skill than most. He moved his hand from her hair to her waist, pulling her flush against him. The contact was electric. The thin silk of her gown offered no protection against the hard planes of his body. He could feel the rapid, terrified thudding of her heart against his chest. He took her chin in his hand, forcing her to look at him. Her lips were parted, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He didn't wait for her to speak. He captured her mouth in a kiss that was both possessive and demanding. He tasted the sweetness of her, the innocence he had mocked earlier, but he was too consumed by his own desire to recognize it for what it truly was. He moved her toward the bed, his movements firm and unyielding. As they sank into the soft mattress, the shadows of the room seemed to close in around them. Elias was focused on the conquest, on the physical act of dominance that would solidify his ownership of Julian's daughter. He began to undo the small silk buttons at the back of her gown, his fingers clumsy with a sudden, uncharacteristic urgency. Clara's hands came up to his chest, not to push him away, but to steady herself. Her touch was light, tentative, and filled with a raw, vibrating fear that finally began to pierce through Elias's cynicism. He paused, his hands resting on her shoulders, looking down at her. Her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears, her face a mask of silent, dignified suffering. "Why are you shaking like that?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. "I'm not going to break you." "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. I've never been with anyone, Elias. My father kept me. He kept me away from everything." Elias froze. He stared at her, searching her face for the lie, for the calculated deception he was so certain would be there. But there was nothing but a devastating, terrifying honesty in her gaze. He looked at the way she lay there, so small and fragile beneath him, and a cold realization began to settle in his chest. He didn't believe her at first. He continued, his touch becoming more intimate as he sought to prove himself right. He wanted to find the evidence of a past, the marks of a woman who had been handled by others. But as the night progressed, as the initial resistance of her body gave way to a sharp, genuine cry of pain, the truth became undeniable. In the quiet, heavy aftermath, the room felt different. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the rain outside had softened to a gentle patter. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, his breath ragged. He looked back at Clara. She was curled on her side, her face buried in the pillow, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The sheets were stained with the evidence of a purity he had convinced himself didn't exist. For the first time in 10 years, Elias felt a sensation he had long ago purged from his soul: shame. He had approached her like a predator, convinced she was a player in a game she didn't even know existed. He had treated her like a used-up asset, a pawn to be discarded once his hunger was sated. Instead, he had taken the one thing she had left, the only thing her father hadn't been able to sell until the very end. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder, but he didn't touch her. He didn't know how. His hands were built for violence, for taking, for holding on tight. They weren't built for comforting a girl whose world he had just shattered. "Clara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer. She only pulled the silk sheet higher around her neck, as if trying to hide from the man who now legally owned her body. Elias stood up and walked back to the window. The city of London lay before him, a sprawling dark beast, and for the first time, he felt entirely disconnected from it. He had spent his life believing that everyone had a price, and that innocence was a lie told to the weak. But tonight, in the silence of his own home, that belief had been burned away. He looked at his own reflection in the darkened glass. He saw a man who had won everything but felt as though he had just lost something irreplaceable. He was a gangster, a man of blood and iron, and he had just realized that the girl in the bed behind him was the only thing in his world that was truly real. The morning of November 21st was only hours away, and with it would come a new reality. The cynical businessman was gone, replaced by a man who was suddenly, terrifyingly aware of the weight of the life he now held in his hands. He stayed by the window until the first grey light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, the loop of his old life finally broken, replaced by a protective fire that was just beginning to kindle in the darkness of his heart. The morning of November 21st, 1994, arrived not with a roar but with a silent, suffocating grey light that bled through the heavy velvet curtains of the master suite. The rain had finally ceased, leaving the world outside dripping and hushed, as if London itself were holding its breath. Inside the room, the air was stagnant, carrying the fading scent of wood smoke and the sharp metallic tang of a truth that had changed everything. Elias was still standing by the window. He hadn't slept for a single minute. His white shirt was wrinkled, the top 3 buttons undone, and his jaw was shadowed with a thick, dark stubble. He looked less like a king of the underworld and more like a man who had survived a shipwreck. He watched the sun, a pale, distant coin, struggle to climb above the jagged skyline of the city. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that sharp, genuine cry of pain from the night before. It echoed in the hollow spaces of his chest, a sound that refused to be silenced by his usual cold logic. Behind him, he heard the bedsheets rustle. The sound was small, but in the oppressive silence of the room it felt like a gunshot. He didn't turn around immediately. He felt a cowardice he had never known before. He, who had stared down the barrels of loaded guns and walked through the territories of his deadliest enemies without blinking, was afraid to look at a 21-year-old girl. "Are you going to stand there until the world ends, or are you going to finish what you started?" Clara's voice was hoarse, cracked from crying, but it possessed a surprising sharp edge of defiance. Elias slowly turned. Clara was sitting up in the vast bed, the silk sheets pulled tightly to her chin. Her copper hair was a chaotic, beautiful mess, spilling over her shoulders and framing a face that was deathly pale. Her green eyes were bloodshot and swollen, but they were fixed on him with a steady, unflinching intensity. She looked like a wounded creature that had realized it still had teeth. "I'm not going to finish anything, Clara," Elias said, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. He took a step toward the bed, then stopped, seeing her flinch. The movement was instinctive, a physical manifestation of the fear he had instilled in her. It cut through him more deeply than any blade ever could. "I didn't know. I thought your father was lying." "You thought I was just like everyone else in your world," she spat, her voice gaining strength. "You thought I was a commodity that had already been traded 10 times over. You didn't even see me as a person. You saw me as a debt to be collected." Elias walked to the edge of the bed and sat down, keeping a respectful distance. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, before he slowly lowered it onto the silk covering her knees. He could feel her trembling beneath the fabric, a fine, rhythmic vibration of pure terror. "I've lived in the dark for a long time, Clara," he said, looking at his own hand, the scars on his knuckles stark against the cream silk. "In my world, innocence doesn't exist. It's a fairy tale told to children. I assumed you were part of Julian's game. I assumed you knew exactly what you were doing." "I knew I was being sold," she whispered, a single tear escaping and tracing a slow path down her cheek. "But I didn't know it would be like that. I didn't know the man I married would hate me before he even knew my name." Elias felt a surge of something hot and suffocating in his throat. He moved his hand, his fingers grazing the skin of her forearm where the sleeve of her gown had slipped up. The contact was electric. Her skin was incredibly soft, almost translucent, and as his thumb brushed against her pulse point, he felt the frantic, galloping beat of her heart. For the first time, he didn't touch her to possess her. He touched her because he needed to know she wasn't going to break. He leaned closer, the scent of her rose oil now mixed with the salt of her tears, filling his senses. He reached up, his large, calloused hand cupping the side of her face. He was so careful, his touch so light that it was almost a whisper. He felt the heat of her skin, the dampness of her tears. "I don't hate you," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. "I've spent my life hating everyone, but I don't hate you. I'm sorry, Clara. For the first time in 10 years I'm saying those words, and I mean them. I'm sorry for what I took from you." Clara searched his face, her breath hitching in her chest. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the genuine torment that shadowed his features. For a moment the wall of her defiance crumbled, and she leaned into his palm, a small broken sound escaping her lips. "You can't give it back," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't make me the person I was yesterday." "No," Elias agreed, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. The contact was charged with a new, complicated sensuality, one born of guilt and a budding, protective obsession. "But I can make sure that no one else ever hurts you again. Not your father, not my enemies, no one." He moved his hand to the back of her neck, pulling her toward him until their foreheads rested against each other. He could feel her warmth, the way her breath stuttered against his lips. It was an intimate, heavy moment, a bridge being built over a chasm of blood and betrayal. "I want you to stay in this room today," Elias commanded, though his tone was softer now, almost pleading. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, will bring you whatever you need. I have business to attend to. I need to find out exactly how much your father lied to me." Clara pulled back slightly, her eyes hardening again. "What are you going to do to him?" Elias stood up, his face hardening into the mask of the gangster once more. He straightened his shirt, the transformation back into the predator almost instantaneous. "He sold me a lie, Clara, and in my world, there is a very high price for that. But don't worry, I'm doing this for us now, not for the debt." He walked to the door, but before he left, he turned back. Clara was still sitting in the middle of the bed, looking small and fragile in the vastness of the room. "Clara," he said, his hand on the heavy brass handle, "from this moment on, you aren't a pawn. You're my wife, and in London, that means you're the most protected woman in the city. Try to remember that." He closed the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing in the hallway. He didn't head for the stairs. He leaned his head against the wood of the door, closing his eyes. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He had spent his life building walls, ensuring that no one could ever get close enough to hurt him. But in one night, a girl with copper hair and green eyes had bypassed every defense he had. He walked down the stairs, his footsteps heavy on the marble. Marcus was waiting for him in the foyer, holding a folder and a cup of black coffee. "You look like hell, Elias," Marcus remarked, his eyes scanning his friend's face with concern. "Did the girl give you trouble?" Elias took the coffee, the heat of the cup grounding him. "The girl is the only thing in this house that isn't a lie, Marcus. I want you to get the car. We're going to Julian's. I want every ledger, every phone record, and every scrap of paper he's touched in the last 5 years. He didn't just sell her to me. He set me up to be the villain in her life. And I'm going to make him pay for the interest." As they stepped out into the cold, damp morning air, Elias felt a cold, focused rage settling over him. He was no longer just a businessman settling a debt. He was a man on a mission of retribution. The loop of his cynicism had been snapped, replaced by a protective fire that would burn anyone who dared to stand in his way. The car pulled away from the estate, leaving the house of glass and steel behind. Upstairs in the master suite, Clara walked to the window. She watched the black sedan disappear into the fog, her hand resting on the cold glass. She felt the weight of the platinum ring on her finger, no longer just a shackle, but a mark of a man who was beginning to realize that the most valuable thing he owned wasn't his empire. It was the heart of the girl he had tried to break. The drive back to the townhouse in the heart of London was conducted in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical presence. The date was still November 21st, 1994, but for Elias, the world had shifted on its axis since the sun had last set. He sat in the back of the sedan, his fingers tracing the phantom sensation of Clara's soft, trembling skin. The memory of her rose-scented warmth and the shattering realization of her innocence burned in his mind like a brand. He felt a cold surgical rage directed at the man who had orchestrated this tragedy, a man who had sold his own daughter as if she were a piece of tainted meat. When they arrived at Julian's residence, the mist was still clinging to the iron railings like a damp shroud. Elias didn't wait for Marcus to open the door. He stepped out, his long stride eating up the distance to the front entrance. He didn't knock. He signaled to Marcus, who delivered a single powerful kick to the lock. The wood splintered with a sound like a breaking bone, and the door swung open to reveal a hallway that smelled of cheap gin and mounting panic. They found Julian in the study, the very room where the transaction had first been proposed. He was frantically stuffing papers into a leather briefcase, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. When he saw Elias standing in the doorway, his face went from a pale grey to a translucent white. He dropped the briefcase, and a flurry of documents scattered across the threadbare carpet like autumn leaves. "Elias," Julian choked out, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of supplication. "You're supposed to be on your honeymoon. I didn't expect you— I thought you would be occupied." Elias walked into the room, his presence filling the small, cluttered space until Julian was backed against the wall. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quietness of his tone was far more terrifying than any shout. "Occupied," Elias repeated, the word tasting like bile. "I was occupied, Julian. I was busy discovering that you are a far bigger liar than even I imagined. I've lived my life among thieves, murderers, and traitors. But you are something else entirely." Julian tried to slide toward the desk, but Marcus stepped into his path, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," Julian stammered. "I gave you what I promised, A beautiful girl, a pure girl, I settled my debt. Elias reached out and grabbed Julian by the collar of his silk robe, hoisting him upward until his toes barely touched the floor. The proximity was nauseating. Elias could see every broken capillary in the man's nose, every bead of sweat born of cowardice. "You told me she was a woman of the world," Elias hissed, his eyes burning with a dark, vengeful fire. "You implied she had been used before. You made me believe I was just the latest in a long line of men who had paid for her time. You wanted me to treat her like a commodity, Julian. You wanted me to break her so she would never come back to you, didn't you? You wanted her gone so you could take whatever money you had left and disappear." Julian's eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "I had to. If you knew the truth, you might have thought she was too fragile. You might not have taken the deal. I needed that debt cleared, Elias. I'm in deep with people who aren't as reasonable as you." Elias felt a surge of disgust so powerful it nearly eclipsed his rage. He shoved Julian back into his chair and turned his attention to the desk. He began to tear through the drawers, tossing aside unpaid bills and empty bottles. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a false lining, he found a small, locked metal box. He didn't ask for a key. He handed it to Marcus, who pried it open with a heavy screwdriver in seconds. Inside were letters, handwritten notes on delicate stationery. Elias picked one up. The date was May 14th, 1992. It was a letter from Clara's mother, written shortly before she died. In it, she begged Julian to protect Clara, to keep her away from the filth of his business dealings, and to ensure she found a man who would love her for who she was, not what she could provide. Tucked behind the letters was a ledger. Elias flipped through the pages. It wasn't a business ledger, it was a record of Julian's personal betrayals. It detailed how he had systematically isolated Clara, how he had fired every tutor who showed her kindness, and how he had spent months marketing her to various figures in the underground, testing the waters to see who would pay the highest price for her untouched status. Elias realized with a sickening clarity that Julian hadn't just lied about Clara's past. He had cultivated her innocence like a farmer prepares a crop for slaughter. He had kept her in that tower not to protect her, but to increase her market value. And he had lied to Elias about her experience to ensure that Elias would approach her with the coldness and brutality that would forever scar her soul, ensuring she would never have the strength to leave the man who now owned her. "You planned this," Elias whispered, the ledger trembling in his hand. "You orchestrated her trauma to save your own skin. You knew exactly what I would do to her once we were alone. You counted on my cynicism to do your dirty work." Julian was sobbing now, a pathetic, wet sound that filled the room. "I did what I had to do. She's just a girl, Elias. She'll get over it. She has your protection now. She's better off." Elias turned, his face a mask of such pure, cold malice that even Marcus took a half step back. He walked to the desk and picked up a heavy glass paperweight. For a heartbeat, he considered using it to end Julian's miserable existence. The world would be a cleaner place without him. But then he thought of Clara, of her green eyes, her copper hair, and the way she had leaned into his hand that morning, seeking a comfort he hadn't known how to give. If he killed her father today, he would be the monster Julian wanted him to be. He would be proving that there was no hope for redemption, no way out of the darkness. "Get out," Elias said, his voice barely audible. Julian stopped sobbing. "What?" "Get out of this house," Elias ordered, his grip on the paperweight tightening. "Take your briefcase and whatever lies you have left. If I ever see your face in London again, if you so much as breathe in the direction of my estate, I won't just kill you. I will dismantle everything you've ever touched until there is nothing left but dust. You have 60 minutes to get to the docks and find a boat to nowhere. Go." Julian didn't need to be told a third time. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed his briefcase, and bolted from the room. Elias heard his frantic footsteps echoing down the hallway, followed by the sound of a car engine roaring to life and speeding away into the fog. Elias stood in the middle of the ruined study, the ledger still in his hand. The silence that followed was hollow. He looked at the letters from Clara's mother. He tucked them into his coat pocket, a small piece of her history he could return to her. "What now, boss?" Marcus asked, his voice unusually gentle. Elias looked out the window at the grey London sky. He felt the weight of the city pressing down on him, but his mind was already miles away, in a bedroom filled with the scent of roses. "Now," Elias said, his voice firming with a new, singular purpose. "I go back to my wife. I have a lot of things to explain and even more to make right. I thought I bought a debt, Marcus, but I think I found the only thing in this world worth saving." He walked out of the townhouse, leaving the rot of Julian's life behind. As the car pulled away, the loop of his past was finally closing. He was no longer just the man in the suit. He was a man who had seen the light in the eyes of an innocent girl and realized that the darkness he had lived in for so long was no longer enough. The journey back to the estate would be the longest of his life, but for the first time, Elias wasn't driving toward a deal or a confrontation. He was driving toward a chance at a soul. The evening of November 21st, 1994, descended upon the estate like a velvet shroud, stitched with the silver threads of a lingering London mist. Inside the library, the air was warm, a sanctuary of aged leather, polished mahogany, and the rhythmic, comforting crackle of a cedar fire. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment, his silhouette casting a long, jagged shadow across the Persian rug. He had changed out of his suit into a charcoal cashmere sweater and dark trousers, a softer image that felt at odds with the storm still raging in his mind. Clara was seated in a high-backed emerald chair near the hearth. She was wrapped in a thick, cream-colored wool shawl that made her look even smaller and more delicate than she had that morning. Her copper hair was pulled back in a loose braid, leaving the elegant curve of her neck exposed to the amber glow of the flames. She was staring into the fire, her green eyes reflecting the dancing light with a haunting intensity. She didn't look up when he entered, but he saw her shoulders tense, a subtle hardening of her posture that spoke of a defensive wall she wasn't ready to tear down. Elias walked toward her, his footsteps muffled by the heavy carpet. In his hand, he carried the small metal box and the letters he had recovered from her father's house. He stopped beside her chair, the heat from the fireplace prickling his skin. He felt a strange, heavy lump in his throat, a sensation of uncertainty that was entirely foreign to a man who had spent his life giving orders. "I went to your father's house," Elias said, his voice a low, rough murmur that seemed to blend with the sound of the burning wood. Clara finally looked up, her gaze sharp and questioning. "Did you kill him?" Elias shook his head, a ghost of a weary smile touching his lips. "No, I sent him away. He won't be coming back to London, Clara. He's no longer a threat to you or to me." He reached out and placed the metal box on the small table beside her. "I found these. They belong to your mother. He had them hidden away." Clara's hand trembled as she reached for the box. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, then she looked at the bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. As she recognized the delicate, slanted script of her mother's handwriting, a soft, broken gasp escaped her lips. She didn't open them immediately. She held them to her chest, her eyes closing as she inhaled the faint, ghostly scent of lavender and old paper that still clung to the stationery. "Why did you bring them to me?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have burned them. You could have used them to mock me." Elias sat on the edge of the hearth, his knees inches from hers. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his thighs. "Because I was wrong about you, Clara. I thought you were a participant in your father's games. I thought your innocence was a mask. But I found his records. I know how he isolated you. I know how he marketed you." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I'm not a good man, Clara. My hands have done things that would make you hate the very sight of me. But I'm not the man your father wanted me to be for you. I won't be the instrument of your destruction." Clara set the letters down and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the lens of pure terror. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his large hands were clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white. She reached out, her fingers hesitating in the air, before she gently touched the back of his hand. Elias flinched slightly at the contact, the warmth of her skin sending a jolt through his system that was more powerful than any adrenaline rush he had ever experienced. He didn't pull away. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. Her palm was soft, her skin like silk against his calloused grip. "You have scars," she said softly, her eyes tracing the jagged white line that ran across his thumb, and up toward his wrist. "I have many," Elias replied. He let go of her hand and slowly pulled up the sleeve of his sweater, revealing a long puckered scar on his forearm from an old knife wound. This was from 1982, a deal that went south in a basement in Soho. And this one, he pointed to a circular mark near his elbow, was from a night in 1986 when I thought I was untouchable. Clara leaned forward, her face close to his arm. She reached out and traced the path of the knife wound with the tip of her finger. The touch was feather-light, a slow, sensual exploration that made the air in the room feel suddenly, intensely thick. Elias watched her, his breath hitching in his chest. He could smell the rose oil on her skin, the scent intensified by the heat of the fire. "My scars are on the inside," Clara whispered, her green eyes lifting to meet his. "They don't show on my skin, but they are there. My father's silence, the way he looked at me like I was a thing to be sold. The fear that I would never be seen for who I am." Elias felt a surge of protective possessiveness, so fierce it took his breath away. He reached up, his hand cupping the back of her head, his thumb stroking the soft skin behind her ear. He pulled her gently toward him until their faces were inches apart. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her features, highlighting the fullness of her lips and the vulnerability in her gaze. "I see you, Clara," he murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register. "I see the woman who survived that tower. I see the girl who didn't break, even when the world tried to crush her." He leaned in, his mouth hovering just a fraction of an inch from hers. He could feel her warmth, her ragged breath against his lips. This wasn't the territorial claim of their wedding night. This was an invitation, a tentative bridge being built in the darkness. Clara didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders, her fingers digging slightly into the soft cashmere of his sweater. When his lips finally touched hers, it was slow, a deep and lingering exploration that tasted of cedar and salt. It was a kiss, born of shared pain and the first flickering spark of a connection that neither of them had expected to find. Her mouth was soft and yielding, and as he deepened the kiss, he felt her heart hammering against his chest. No longer out of pure terror, but out of a new, terrifying heat. Elias pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. His hands were buried in her hair, the copper strands feeling like liquid silk. He felt a hunger for her that was no longer just about physical conquest. It was about the need to be the one who finally gave her a reason to feel safe. "I'm going to make this right, Clara," he promised, his voice a low vow. "Everything your father took from you, everything I took from you, I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Clara looked at him, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of hope and fear. "It's a long road, Elias. We are both broken in our own ways." "Then we'll be broken together," he said, his hand sliding down to the nape of her neck, pulling her back into a warm, protective embrace. They sat there for a long time, two souls forged in different fires, finding a strange, quiet peace in the heart of a London winter. But as the clock in the hallway struck 1, a cold wind rattled the library windows, a reminder that the world outside was still full of shadows and men who wouldn't let Elias change his path so easily. The spark had been lit, but the storm was far from over. The morning of November 22nd, 1994, broke with a sky the color of cold wood ash. A thin, biting wind whistled through the narrow alleys of the East End, carrying the scent of salt from the river and the metallic tang of industry. Elias stood in the center of a dimly lit boxing gym in Whitechapel, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a heavy bag being struck, echoing through the rafters. He wasn't the one training. He stood in the shadows, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his long wool coat, his eyes fixed on a man in the ring who moved with the grace of a predatory cat. Arthur was 10 years younger than Elias, a man built of lean muscle and unbridled ambition. He represented the new breed of London's underworld, men who had no respect for the old codes of silence and territory. For months, Arthur had been nibbling at the edges of Elias's empire, testing the strength of his borders. And now the whispers on the street had given him a new weapon, the rumor that the Iron King of London had finally found a weakness in the form of a copper-haired girl. Arthur climbed out of the ring, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy towel. He didn't look at Elias directly, but a sharp, mocking grin played across his lips. "I heard the wedding was a quiet affair, Elias. No invitations for your old friends?" I was hurt, truly. Elias stepped into the light, his presence instantly draining the air from the room. The two men who had been training stopped, their eyes darting between the Titan and the Challenger. "You weren't invited because you aren't a friend, Arthur. You're a tenant, and your rent is due." Arthur laughed, a harsh, dry sound. He walked closer until only a few feet separated them. The smell of stale sweat and cheap liniment was pungent. "I heard you married a little bird, a virgin from what the gossip says. That's a dangerous thing for a man like you, Elias. Innocence is a heavy weight to carry in a storm. It makes a man slow. It makes him soft." The word soft hung in the air like a death sentence. Elias felt a cold, familiar fire igniting in his gut. He reached out, his movement so fast it was a blur, and gripped Arthur by the front of his damp shirt. He slammed the younger man against the brick wall of the gym, the impact rattling the framed photographs of old champions. "Listen to me very carefully," Elias whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "You can talk about my business. You can talk about my territory. But if you so much as breathe her name again, if you even think about looking in the direction of my home, I will bury you so deep that the devil himself won't be able to find your soul. Do you understand?" Arthur's eyes widened, the bravado flickering for a second, but he didn't back down. He gripped Elias's wrists, his fingers digging into the expensive wool. "The streets are talking, Elias. They say you've changed. They say you spent your wedding night crying over a girl instead of breaking her. If you want to keep your crown, you'd better show them that you still have teeth, because if you don't, someone else will take it, and they might take the girl as a trophy." Elias shoved him away, his hands trembling with a rage he struggled to contain. He turned and walked out of the gym without another word, the sound of Arthur's mocking whistle following him into the cold November air. He climbed into the back of his car where Marcus was waiting. "We have a problem," Elias stated, his gaze fixed on the grey streets passing by. "Arthur thinks he's found a crack in the wall. He's going to move on the South Docks by the end of the week. He wants to see if I'll leave the house to defend them." "Are you going to?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "I have to," Elias replied. "If I don't crush him now, every two-bit hustler in the city will think they can take a shot at us. But I won't leave her unprotected. I want 6 men on the perimeter of the estate, 24 hours a day. Nobody goes in or out without my personal clearance." When Elias returned to the estate later that afternoon, the house felt like a different world. The violence and the threats of the docks felt 1,000 miles away. He found Clara in the small conservatory, the afternoon light filtering through the glass and casting long, pale shadows across the floor. She was reading one of the letters from her mother, her face serene and beautiful. As he watched her, the tension in his shoulders began to dissolve. He walked over to her, his footsteps soft. Clara looked up and smiled, a genuine, warm expression that made his heart skip a beat. She stood up and met him halfway, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "You look tired," she said softly, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Elias didn't answer with words. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled the scent of her, rose oil and something clean and sweet that belonged only to her. He felt the softness of her body against the hard lines of his own, a contrast that felt both terrifying and essential. He moved his hands down her back, pressing her closer, his fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. He felt a desperate primal need to remind himself that she was real, that she was safe, and that she was his. He began to kiss her neck, his touch becoming more urgent, his breath hot against her skin. Clara responded with a soft moan, her fingers tangling in his hair. She leaned back, allowing him access to the sensitive curve of her throat. The sensuality between them was no longer a matter of obligation. It was a mutual hunger, a fire that burned brighter because of the darkness that surrounded them. Elias lifted her slightly, his hands gripping her thighs as he pressed her against the cool glass wall of the conservatory. The heat of their bodies was intense, a private storm within the glass. He stopped just short of taking her right there, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I have to go away for a few days," Elias whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of desire and dread. "Business in the south, but I'm leaving Marcus here. You'll be safe, Clara, I promise you." Clara looked at him, her green eyes filled with a sudden, sharp intuition. "It's because of me, isn't it? The trouble. They think you're weak because of me." Elias cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "They think I'm weak because they don't understand what it means to have something worth fighting for. They're about to find out that a man with everything to lose is the most dangerous man in London." He kissed her one last time, a deep, lingering promise that tasted of salt and iron. He didn't want to leave, but he knew that if he didn't face the shadow of his past now, it would eventually swallow their future. As he walked out to the car, the first flakes of an early winter snow began to fall, dusting the black leather of his shoes with white. He didn't look back. He had a war to win, and for the first time in his life, the stakes weren't about money or power. They were about the light in a girl's eyes and the peace he had found in the middle of a storm. The loop of the conflict was tightening. Arthur was waiting in the shadows, and Elias was driving straight into the heart of the fire, unaware that the real danger might not be on the docks at all, but much closer to home. The afternoon of November 25th, 1994, was a study in monochromatic stillness. A thick, heavy blanket of snow had finally settled over the city, muffling the usual roar of London until it was nothing more than a ghostly hum. Inside the estate, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Clara stood in the center of the drawing room, her breath fogging the cold glass of the window. Elias had been gone for 3 days, and the isolation was beginning to feel like a physical weight, a suffocating velvet curtain that pressed against her lungs. She was dressed in a high-necked sweater of charcoal wool and dark trousers, her copper hair pinned back in a severe, elegant knot. She felt like a prisoner in a palace of glass. Every time she looked out the window, she saw the dark silhouettes of Elias's men pacing the perimeter, their eyes scanning the tree line like hungry wolves. She knew why they were there. She knew the city was hungry for a piece of the man she had married, and she knew she was the most vulnerable point in his armor. By 3 in the afternoon, the restlessness became unbearable. She needed to feel the pavement beneath her shoes, to hear the voices of people who didn't talk in codes or carry death under their jackets. She found Marcus in the kitchen, nursing a mug of black coffee, his eyes fixed on a wall of security monitors. "I need to go to the city, Marcus," Clara said, her voice steady and brook no argument. "There's a bookstore in Bloomsbury that has a collection of my mother's favorite poems. I want to find it." Marcus didn't look up immediately. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. "Elias gave strict orders, Clara. You don't leave the grounds, not until he's back from the docks." "Elias isn't here," she countered, stepping closer to the table. "And I'm not a child to be locked away. You have 6 men outside. Take 2 of them. We'll be back before the sun sets. If I stay in this house for 1 more hour, I'll lose my mind." Marcus sighed, the sound a low rumble in his chest. He looked at her, seeing the flash of defiance in her green eyes, the same fire that had begun to captivate Elias. He knew that if he refused, she might try something truly dangerous. "Fine. But we take the armored car, and we don't stop for anything but the light. You stay within 2 feet of me at all times." The drive into the city was tense. The snow-clogged streets made for slow progress, the black sedan crawling through the slush like a cautious predator. London looked beautiful and treacherous under the white powder, the Victorian architecture, casting long, distorted shadows across the ice. When they arrived at the small bookstore on a quiet side street, the air was biting and sharp, smelling of wet wool and wood smoke. Clara felt a surge of joy as she stepped into the warmth of the shop. The scent of old paper and vanilla was a balm to her frayed nerves. She spent 40 minutes lost in the stacks, finally finding a worn, leather-bound volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. As she walked back to the counter, she felt a strange prickle at the base of her neck. She looked through the front window. A black van had pulled up across the street, its engine idling, a thin ribbon of exhaust curling into the grey air. Marcus, who had been standing by the door, suddenly stiffened. His hand moved toward the holster hidden beneath his coat. "Clara, get down," Marcus whispered, his voice sharp and urgent. "What? Get down, now!" The front window of the bookstore exploded in a shower of glittering shards. The sound was deafening, the rhythmic staccato crack, crack, crack of a submachine gun. Clara screamed, diving behind a heavy mahogany shelf as books rained down on her like wounded birds. She felt the heat of a bullet whistle past her ear, the smell of cordite and pulverized plaster filling her nose. Across the street, two men in dark masks were leaning out of the van, their weapons spitting fire into the shop. Marcus was on one knee, his own gun drawn, returning fire with a calm, lethal precision. He grabbed Clara by the collar of her sweater, dragging her toward the back exit. "Stay low," he barked, his eyes scanning the alleyway behind the shop. They burst out into the cold air, the snow crunching beneath their feet. A second car was waiting at the end of the alley, blocking their path. Two men stepped out, their faces obscured by scarves. Clara felt a cold, paralyzing terror wash over her. This was the world Elias lived in, a world where life was measured in seconds and blood was the only currency. Just as the men raised their weapons, a third vehicle, a heavy black SUV, roared into the alley from the opposite direction. It slammed into the side of the attacker's car with a sickening crunch of metal. The door flew open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. Elias stepped out. He didn't look like the man who had kissed her in the library. His face was a mask of such pure, unadulterated rage that he looked inhuman. He carried a heavy shotgun in his large hands, his eyes fixed on the men who had dared to touch his wife. The violence that followed was swift and absolute. Elias moved with a terrifying fluid grace, his weapon firing with a thunderous roar that echoed off the brick walls. Clara watched, frozen in horror, as one of the men was thrown back against the wall, a crimson spray painting the pristine white snow. Elias didn't stop. He walked toward the second man, who was fumbling with a jammed pistol. Elias grabbed the man by the throat, hoisting him up with one hand. The man's feet dangled, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. "Elias, stop!" Clara cried out, her voice trembling. He didn't hear her. He slammed the man's head against the brick wall once, twice, until the struggling ceased. He dropped the body into the slush, like it was nothing more than a bag of refuse. He turned toward the van at the end of the alley, his eyes searching for more targets. But the vehicle had already sped away, its tires screeching on the ice. Elias stood in the center of the alley, his chest heaving, the steam from his breath rising like smoke. He looked at his hands, which were splattered with the warm blood of his enemies. He slowly turned his gaze toward Clara. She was huddled against the back door of the bookstore, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and absolute horror. She saw the monster. She saw the man who had built an empire on the broken bodies of others. The sensual heat they had shared just days before felt like a distant, impossible dream. Elias walked toward her, his boots heavy on the snow. He reached out to touch her, to check for injuries, but Clara flinched. She pulled back, her hands trembling as she clutched the book of poetry to her chest. "You're bleeding," Elias said, his voice a low, ragged growl. He reached for a small scratch on her cheek, caused by a flying shard of glass. "Don't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't touch me with those hands, Elias." The words hit him harder than any bullet ever could. He froze, his hand hovering in the cold air between them. He looked down at the blood on his knuckles, then back at the girl who had become his only source of light. The gap between their worlds had never felt wider. "I was protecting you," he said, his voice thick with a desperate, dark justification. "You were killing them," she countered, tears finally spilling over her cheeks, "right in front of me, like it was nothing." The sirens of the London police began to wail in the distance, a thin, lonely sound in the winter air. Marcus approached them, his face grim. "We have to go, Elias, now. The perimeter is compromised." Elias grabbed Clara's arm, this time with a firm, unavoidable grip, and led her toward the SUV. She didn't fight him, but she was a statue, her spirit withdrawing into a place he couldn't reach. As they pulled away from the blood-stained alley, leaving the chaos behind, the silence in the car was more devastating than the gunfire. Elias watched Clara through the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her hand tracing the silver ring on her finger. The loop of their romance had been severed by the reality of his life. He had saved her body, but as the snow continued to fall over the city, he realized with a sickening dread that he might have just lost her soul. The night of November 26, 1994, was a hollow vessel, filled with the echoing silence of the North London estate. Outside, the snow had turned to a treacherous ice, coating the trees in a skeletal, crystalline armor. Inside the master suite, the only light came from the fireplace, where a single massive log burned with a low blue flame. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the dying storm and the heavy metallic ghost of the day's violence. Elias sat on the edge of the large silk-covered bed, his head bowed. He had spent 2 hours in the bathroom, scrubbing his hands until the skin was raw and red, trying to wash away the memory of the blood in the alley. He was dressed only in black silk trousers, his broad chest and scarred shoulders exposed to the cool air. The flickering firelight danced across the map of his history, the bullet wounds, the blade marks, making them look like dark, living things. He felt a profound, crushing weight in his chest, a sense of failure that no amount of territory or power could offset. He had wanted to be her protector, and instead, he had shown her the very thing she feared most. Clara stood by the heavy oak door, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. She had changed into a thin, translucent nightgown of emerald silk that flowed around her like water. Her copper hair was loose, a wild, fiery halo that caught the orange glow of the embers. She watched him for a long time, her green eyes unreadable. She had spent the afternoon in a state of shock, the image of Elias's rage playing on a loop in her mind. But as the hours passed, the horror had begun to be replaced by a different, sharper realization. She walked toward the bed, her bare feet silent on the thick carpet. Elias didn't look up, but his entire body tensed as she approached. He looked like a fallen titan, a man who had built a world of iron only to find it too heavy to carry. "I thought you would be in the guest wing," Elias said, his voice a low, hollow rumble. "I thought you wouldn't want to be in the same room as me." Clara stopped just inches from him. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the top of his head, tracing the short, dark hair. "I went to the library. I read the poems. There is a line by Browning about how the heart has reasons that reason does not know. I saw what you did today, Elias. I saw the monster." Elias finally looked up, his eyes dark with a devastating, silent agony. And I realized that the monster was only unleashed because someone tried to take me away," she whispered, her voice gaining a steady, resonant strength. "My father sold me to save himself. My enemies tried to kill me to hurt you. But you fought for me. You are the only person in my entire life who has ever put my safety above their own profit." She sat down beside him, the mattress dipping under her light weight. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had taken a life just hours before, and brought it to her face. She pressed his palm against her cheek, her eyes closing as she leaned into his touch. Elias felt a jolt of pure, agonizing electricity. He tried to pull away, his fingers curling instinctively. "Don't," he groaned, his voice breaking. "My hands are filthy, Clara." "Then let me help you clean them," she replied, her green eyes opening and locking onto his. She leaned in, her mouth grazing the corner of his lips. The contact was feather-light, a tentative invitation that sent a wave of heat crashing through Elias's defenses. He groaned again, but this time it was a sound of surrender. He reached up, his large hands capturing her waist, pulling her onto his lap. The emerald silk of her gown was cool against his hot skin, a delicious, agonizing contrast. Elias buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her rose oil, which was now mixed with the warm, muskier scent of her own skin. He felt the frantic, heavy thudding of her heart against his chest, but it wasn't the gallop of fear. It was a rhythmic, rising hunger. He began to kiss her neck, his touch becoming more urgent, his lips tracing the delicate line of her collarbone. Clara gasped, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. She tilted her head back, offering him the vulnerability of her throat. "I choose this, Elias," she murmured, her voice a breathless vow. "I'm not a debt anymore. I'm not a prisoner. I am your wife, and I choose to be here." The words acted like a match to a powder keg. Elias lifted her, laying her back against the silk sheets. He followed her down, his heavy frame hovering over her, his eyes searching hers one last time. He saw no hesitation, only a deep, smouldering fire that mirrored his own. He began to kiss her with a desperate, all-consuming passion, his mouth tasting of salt and wine and the promise of a new beginning. His hands moved over her body with a slow, reverent exploration. He traced the curve of her hip, the softness of her stomach, the weight of her breasts beneath the thin silk. Every touch was a question, and every soft moan from her lips was an answer. He moved with a careful, deliberate sensuality, ensuring that every sensation was mutual, every movement a shared discovery. The fire in the hearth flared, casting long, dancing shadows across their intertwined bodies. As the night progressed, the barriers between them, the blood, the lies, the fear, seemed to dissolve in the heat of their contact. It was an intimate, intense exchange that transcended the physical. Elias felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in 20 years, a feeling of being anchored to something pure and real in the middle of a chaotic world. Clara felt her own strength blooming, the realization that she could hold the heart of a man like Elias and not be crushed by it. In the quiet, sweat-slicked hours that followed, they lay tangled together under the heavy down comforter. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing orange embers, and the room was filled with the soft, synchronized sound of their breathing. Elias held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head, his arm a protective weight across her waist. "I won't let them win, Clara," Elias whispered into the darkness, his voice firm and steady. "Arthur, the docks, the streets. They won't take this from us." Clara shifted, her hand resting over his heart. "I know. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. I am part of this world now, Elias. For better or for worse." Elias closed his eyes, a single tear of relief tracing a path down his temple. He had entered this marriage expecting a transaction, but he had found a sanctuary. As the clock in the hallway struck 4, signaling the approach of a new day, the loop of their intimacy felt unbreakable. But beneath the quiet, a new shadow was forming. Elias knew that Arthur wouldn't stop at a failed ambush in the city. The next move would be more calculated, and as he drifted into a shallow sleep, he felt the first chilling premonition that the greatest betrayal was yet to come, not from an enemy outside the walls, but from someone he had trusted with his life. The morning of November 27th, 1994, arrived with a deceptive tranquility. A soft, white light filtered through the frosted panes of the master suite, casting a pearlescent glow over the tangled silk sheets. For a few stolen minutes, the world of blood and iron felt like a distant memory. Elias lay awake, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Clara's shoulder as she slept beside him. The scent of her rose oil was faint now, replaced by the warm, intimate fragrance of their shared night. He felt a fierce, terrifying need to stay in this room forever, to bar the doors and let the city burn itself out beyond the gates. But the city never stopped. By 8 in the morning, the grandfather clock in the hallway began its steady, uncompromising toll. Elias rose, his movements careful as he dressed in a dark suit of charcoal wool. He felt the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him, but today they felt different. He wasn't just defending an empire, he was defending a sanctuary. He found Marcus in the study, surrounded by a mountain of paperwork and the blue haze of cigarette smoke. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, and his jaw was set in a hard, unforgiving line. "We've been through the phone records of every man on the perimeter," Marcus said, his voice a low grate. "Nothing. Whoever tipped off Arthur's crew in the city was careful. They used a payphone or a burner. But Elias, there's no way Arthur could have known about the bookstore in Bloomsbury. It wasn't on any of our scheduled routes. It was a last-minute decision." Elias sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the leather surface. That means someone inside this house was listening, someone who heard Clara ask to go. "I've vetted everyone, boss. These men have been with us for 5-10 years. Then vet them again," Elias commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous low vibration. The tension in the house remained thick throughout the day. Elias spent hours in meetings with his senior captains, watching their faces for the slightest flicker of guilt. He looked for a tell, a bead of sweat, a diverted gaze, but found nothing. His men were professionals, trained to hide their emotions behind masks of stone. It was Clara who finally broke the stalemate. She entered the study late in the afternoon, carrying a tray of tea and small sandwiches. She had seen the way Elias had been pacing, the way his eyes had become hard and distant again. She didn't say anything at first, simply placing the tray on the desk and standing by his side. "You're looking for a wolf, but you're searching in the wrong forest," she said softly, her hand resting on his shoulder. Elias looked up, surprised by the clarity in her voice. "What do you mean?" "I spent my life in my father's house watching men," Clara explained, her green eyes sharp and focused. "When you have no voice, you learn to see everything. My father didn't just have associates. He had friends in places he shouldn't. He used to talk about a man he called the Shadow, someone inside your organization who kept him informed of your shipments." Elias stood up, his interest piqued. "Did he ever give you a name?" "No, but he mentioned a specific habit. He said the man always smelled of expensive foreign tobacco, something that smelled like cloves and old leather. And he said the man had a peculiar way of folding his handkerchief into a perfect triangle." Elias froze. He slowly turned his gaze toward a stack of ledgers on the corner of his desk. He remembered a meeting 3 months ago, on August 14th, 1994. He had been sitting with his senior lieutenant, Vaughn, a man who had been at his side for nearly 7 years. Vaughn was the one who managed the payroll for the perimeter guards, and Vaughn was the only man in the inner circle who smoked imported Indonesian kretek, clove-scented cigarettes. "Marcus!" Elias bellowed. When Marcus entered, Elias didn't explain. He simply pointed toward the guest wing where the officers' quarters were located. "Bring me Vaughn, and bring his personal effects. Everything." The confrontation took place in the library an hour later. Vaughn was a man of 50, with a silver-shot beard and an air of quiet competence. He stood in the center of the room, his expression one of confused innocence. But as Marcus tossed a small black ledger onto the table, one found hidden inside the lining of Vaughn's suitcase, the mask began to slip. Inside the ledger were dates and amounts. It was a record of payments from Julian, Clara's father, dating back to October 1991. It wasn't just about the bookstore. Vaughn had been selling Elias's secrets for years. "Why?" Elias asked, his voice devoid of emotion, which was far more terrifying than rage. "I gave you everything, Vaughn. Loyalty, money, a seat at the head of the table." Vaughn looked at the floor, his shoulders sagging. "Julian promised me a percentage of the shipping docks once you were removed. He said you were getting careless, that you were too focused on the old ways. And then the girl came. He told me that marrying her would be your final mistake. He said it would make you soft, and he was right." Elias stepped closer, his presence looming over the older man. The smell of cloves was faint but unmistakable. He felt a surge of betrayal so sharp it made his vision blur. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, triangularly folded handkerchief he had taken from Vaughn's desk. He threw it at the man's feet. "The girl didn't make me soft, Vaughn," Elias hissed. "She made me realize exactly what I was missing. She gave me eyes to see the snakes in my own garden." Elias turned to Marcus. "Take him to the basement. I want to know everything he told Arthur. I want to know every shipment that's been compromised. And when he's finished talking, send him to the docks. He wanted a percentage of the river. Let him see it one last time from the bottom." As Marcus led a trembling Vaughn away, Elias felt a cold, hollow sensation in his gut. The betrayal hit hard, but the realization of Clara's role in uncovering it was even more profound. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, her face pale but her gaze steady. He walked toward her and pulled her into his arms, his grip tight and possessive. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, feeling the warmth of her skin. "You saved me today, Clara. If you hadn't spoken up, I would have kept looking in the dark until it was too late." Clara reached up, her fingers stroking the hair at the nape of his neck. "I told you, Elias. I'm part of this world now. Your enemies are mine." The sensuality between them flared again, born of the adrenaline and the shared victory. Elias lifted her chin, his mouth capturing hers in a kiss that was fierce and hungry. It was a claim, a confirmation of their partnership. He moved his hands down her back, pressing her body against his. The heat between them a defiant flame against the cold winter outside. He led her back toward the master suite, the business of the betrayal momentarily pushed aside by the primal need for her presence. But as they walked through the darkened hallway, Elias knew that the war was far from over. Vaughn's confession had revealed that Arthur wasn't just planning a hit, he was planning a full-scale takeover of the South Docks by the middle of December. The loop of the internal threat had been closed, but the external threat was growing into a monster. Elias had his hidden ally by his side, but to protect her he would have to become the most ruthless version of himself once again. The descent for love was about to begin, and as the clock struck midnight, the first shadows of the final conflict were already stretching across the city. The night of December 8th, 1994, was a jagged blade of ice pressing against the throat of London. The city was paralyzed by a frost so deep it cracked the stone of the embankments. A thick yellow fog, the infamous pea souper, had crawled out of the Thames, swallowing the street lamps and turning the world into a claustrophobic maze of shadows and damp echoes. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was equally heavy, a suffocating mixture of unspoken fears and the sharp metallic scent of gun oil. Elias stood in his private armory, a windowless room deep within the bowels of the house. The walls were lined with the tools of his trade: silenced pistols, heavy-caliber rifles, and knives with blackened blades that didn't reflect the light. He was stripping down a customized submachine gun, his fingers moving with a mechanical, haunting precision. He was dressed in a tactical turtleneck of midnight black and heavy trousers, his movements fluid and devoid of the warmth he had shown in the library. To protect the light he had found in Clara, he had to descend back into the absolute darkness that had birthed him. The door creaked open. He didn't need to turn to know it was her. The air in the room shifted, the scent of rose oil cutting through the bitter smell of lubricant and steel. Clara walked toward him, her movements slow and deliberate. She was wearing a thick silk robe of deep crimson, her hair loose and flowing over her shoulders like a river of copper. She stopped beside him, her gaze falling on the weapon in his hands. "You're leaving tonight," she said, her voice a quiet, resonant fact. Elias set the bolt of the gun down and finally turned to face her. His eyes were hard, the deep-seated weariness of his soul masked by a cold, predatory focus. "Arthur's men are moving a shipment of illegal armaments through the South Docks. It's the muscle they need for the takeover. If I don't stop it tonight, they'll have the firepower to march straight to these gates." Clara reached out, her hand hesitant, before she pressed her palm against his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful thud of his heart through the dark fabric. "You look different when you hold those things. You look like the man I saw in the alley, the man I was afraid of." Elias captured her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He brought her hand to his lips, but he didn't kiss it with tenderness. He pressed his mouth against her knuckles with a fierce, desperate pressure. "I have to be that man tonight, Clara. I have to be the monster so that you never have to see one again. I am going to do things tonight that I will never tell you about. I am going to ensure that Arthur is isolated, that his support is gutted, and that he realizes the cost of breathing your name is higher than he can pay." He pulled her closer, his large hands sliding down to the small of her back, pressing her body against the hard, unforgiving lines of his tactical gear. The contrast was agonizing, her softness, her warmth, against the cold reality of his mission. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent as if it were the last breath of air he would ever take. Clara responded by wrapping her arms around his neck, her fingers tangling in the short hair at his nape. She pulled him toward her, her mouth seeking his in a kiss that was filled with a raw, desperate heat. It was a goodbye and a promise, a mutual surrender to the gravity of the moment. Elias responded with a low groan, his hands gripping her thighs, lifting her until she was forced to wrap her legs around his waist. The sensuality between them in the cold armory was intense, a defiant flame against the encroaching violence. He pressed her against the heavy steel cabinet, his mouth tracing the sensitive curve of her throat. He felt her entire body shudder, a rhythmic rising hunger that mirrored the storm in his own gut. For a few feverish minutes, the weapons on the walls and the fog outside didn't exist. There was only the weight of her body, the taste of her skin, and the terrifying realization that she was the only thing holding his soul together. He set her down gently, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Wait for me in the master suite. Don't come down until Marcus tells you it's safe. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Come back to me, Elias, not the monster. Come back to the man who brought me the letters." Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. He picked up his weapon, checked the magazine, and walked out of the room. The descent into the South Docks was a journey into the underworld. The black SUV moved through the fog like a ghost, its headlights extinguished. Elias sat in the back, Marcus beside him. Neither man spoke. They had done this 100 times, but tonight the stakes were personal. They arrived at the warehouse near the riverbank. The structure was a rotting carcass of corrugated iron and salt-eaten wood. Through the fog, Elias saw the silhouettes of Arthur's men moving crates from a rusted freighter. They were laughing, confident in their numbers and their darkness. Elias stepped out into the freezing air. He didn't use a silencer. He wanted them to hear him coming. He wanted the sound of his arrival to be the last thing they remembered. The violence that followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Elias moved through the warehouse with a terrifying, calculated ruthlessness. He used the environment as a weapon, appearing from the shadows like a wraith. He didn't just neutralize the guards. He dismantled them. He destroyed the shipment of arms, the explosions lighting up the foggy night with a hellish orange glow. In the center of the chaos, he found Arthur's second-in-command, a man known for his cruelty. Elias didn't kill him immediately. He pinned him against a stack of burning crates, his hand around the man's throat. "Tell Arthur that I'm not defending my docks anymore," Elias hissed, the heat of the fire reflecting in his dark eyes. "Tell him I'm coming for his heart. Tell him that every man he sends near my wife will end up exactly like this." He left the warehouse as it began to collapse into the river, the screams of the wounded lost in the roar of the flames. He didn't look back at the destruction. He walked back to the car, his boots stained with soot and the cold water of the Thames. When he returned to the estate, the sun was still hours away. The house was silent, a fortress of glass and steel under the winter moon. He bypassed the armory and went straight to the master suite. He stripped off his tactical gear in the hallway, leaving the scent of smoke and gunpowder behind. He entered the room. Clara was awake, sitting by the fireplace, the embers still glowing a faint red. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face for the man she knew. Elias stopped at the edge of the rug, his body feeling like a lead weight. "It's done," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The shipment is gone. Arthur is alone." Clara stood up and walked toward him. She didn't flinch at the sight of the soot on his face or the coldness in his eyes. She reached out and took his hands, her warmth seeping into his frozen skin. "You're shaking," she murmured. "I'm tired, Clara," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I'm so tired of being the man they want me to be." She led him toward the bed, her touch a tether back to reality. As they lay together in the quiet dark, Elias felt the adrenaline finally receding, replaced by a crushing, hollow exhaustion. He held her close, his arms a protective circle around her, his face buried in the silk of her hair. He had done the terrible job. He had protected his empire and his wife. But as he drifted into a fitful sleep, he knew that the final confrontation was still waiting for him. Arthur had been isolated, but a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. The loop of the descent had been completed, but the climax of their story was looming in the shadows of late December, and the price of their peace was about to be demanded in full. The evening of December 24th, 1994, was a tomb of white and silver. London had been buried under a fresh fall of snow that muffled the city's usual mechanical heartbeat, leaving only the whistling wind and the distant, lonely tolling of cathedral bells. Inside the estate, the air was brittle. Elias stood in the center of the library, his gaze fixed on a single crumpled piece of paper that had been pinned to the front gate with a blackened iron nail. It was a message from Arthur, written in a hand that shook with a mixture of rage and desperation. "The coal wharf. Midnight. Bring the girl or I burn the docks with you inside them." Elias felt a cold, familiar stillness settle over him. He wasn't afraid. He was beyond fear. He was a man who had already looked into the abyss and found a reason to climb back out. He was dressed in a long, dark overcoat over a simple black suit, his hands gloved in soft, supple leather. Beneath the coat, his shoulder holster felt like a heavy, reassuring weight. Clara entered the room, her footsteps silent on the rug. She was wearing a thick wool dress the color of a winter sky, her hair pinned up, though a few copper strands had escaped to frame her pale, determined face. She saw the paper in his hand and the look in his eyes. "You aren't taking me," she said, her voice a soft but unbreakable vow. Elias walked toward her, his presence filling the space between them with a protective heat. He reached out, his gloved fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "No, I am going to finish this alone. I've spent my life playing their games, Clara. Tonight, I change the rules." He pulled her into his arms, his grip fierce and possessive. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her, that persistent, beautiful rose oil that had become his only anchor. He felt her hands grip the back of his coat, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric. The sensuality between them was no longer a performance. It was a desperate, primal connection. He pressed her back against the mahogany desk, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of iron and salt. It was a long, deep exchange that felt like a lifetime of unspoken promises. He moved his hands down her body, feeling the curves he had come to adore, the life he was willing to kill for. "Wait for me," he whispered against her lips. "Whatever you hear, whatever the city says tomorrow, wait for me." He left the estate in a nondescript black sedan, driving through the deserted, snow-choked streets of the East End. The coal wharf was a skeletal ruin near the river, a place where the shadows felt thicker than the air itself. The Thames was a dark, churning beast beside it, carrying chunks of ice that groaned like dying animals. Elias stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the frozen slush. He didn't hide. He walked into the center of the wharf, the flickering light of a single, rusting lamp casting his shadow long across the soot-stained snow. Arthur stepped out from behind a stack of rotted timber. He looked like a man who had lost everything. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes disheveled, and his hands trembled as he held a heavy pistol. Beside him, looking smaller and more pathetic than ever, was Julian. Clara's father was shaking so violently, his teeth were audible in the silence. "You didn't bring her," Arthur spat, his voice cracking. "I told you, Elias, I told you I wanted her." "You wanted a trophy, Arthur," Elias replied, his voice a low, melodic rumble that didn't betray a single emotion. "But she's a person, and she's mine. You made the mistake of thinking I've grown soft. You didn't realize that having something to protect makes me more dangerous than you can ever imagine." Julian stepped forward, his voice a reedy whine. "Elias, please. He was going to kill me. He found me at the docks. I had to tell him where you were. I had no choice." Elias looked at the man who had sold his daughter to settle a debt. A wave of profound pity washed over him, followed by a cold, absolute clarity. "You always had a choice, Julian. You just always chose the one that saved your own skin." Arthur raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm going to kill you, Elias, and then I'm going to find her. I'm going to take that estate and I'm going to make her remember my name every night." Elias didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't have to. From the shadows of the warehouse roof, two of Elias's men Arthur thought he had bribed, stepped into view. Marcus had spent the last 48 hours ensuring that Arthur's hidden allies were actually loyal to the Iron King. The trap hadn't been set for Elias. It had been set for the man who thought he could steal a crown. The gunfire was brief and deafening. Arthur was hit twice before he could even register the betrayal. He collapsed into the snow, the crimson of his life's blood spreading across the white surface like a grotesque map. Julian screamed, falling to his knees and covering his head. Elias walked toward Arthur, standing over the dying man. He didn't feel triumph. He only felt a hollow, cold relief. He watched as the light faded from Arthur's eyes, the ambition and the greed finally extinguished by the December frost. He turned toward Julian. The older man was sobbing, his face pressed into the freezing slush. "Go," Elias said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "The car is at the end of the pier. There is a boat waiting in Dover. If I ever hear your name again, if you ever think of trying to contact Clara, I won't use my men. I will do the job myself." Julian didn't wait. He scrambled to his feet and ran toward the car, his footsteps echoing through the hollow wharf. Elias watched him disappear into the fog, a ghost of a man who had never learned the value of love. Elias stood alone in the silence, the snow beginning to fall again, covering the bodies and the blood. He felt a sharp burning pain in his side and realized a stray bullet from Arthur's final desperate shot had grazed his ribs. He pressed a hand to the wound, feeling the warm, sticky blood soaking through his shirt. It was a personal cost, a physical reminder of the world he was trying to leave behind. He walked back to his car, his movements slow and deliberate. He drove back through the city, watching the Christmas lights in the windows of the small flats in Whitechapel. People were sleeping, dreaming of peace and family. For the first time in his life, Elias felt he earned a place in that world. When he arrived at the estate, the gates opened automatically. He walked into the foyer, leaving a trail of melted snow and dark droplets on the marble floor. Clara was waiting at the top of the stairs, her silhouette a beacon in the dim light. She ran down the stairs, her feet bare, and threw herself into his arms. Elias winced as she collided with his side, but he didn't pull away. He held her tight, his head resting against hers. "It's over," he whispered, his voice thick with exhaustion. "They're gone, Clara, all of them." She pulled back, seeing the blood on his coat. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't scream. She took his face in her hands, her thumbs stroking his cheekbones. "You're home. That's all that matters." As she led him toward the master suite to tend to his wounds, the clock in the hallway struck midnight. It was December 25th, 1994. The gangster had survived his final battle, and the girl had found her champion. The loop of the violence was closing, and as they entered the warmth of their room, the first light of a new dawn was already beginning to gather on the horizon of a city that would never be the same. The morning of January 1st, 1995, broke over London with a clarity that felt like a benediction. The heavy, suffocating fogs of December had finally been swept away by a brisk wind from the east, leaving the sky a brilliant, pale blue, the color of a fresh start. Across the city, the remnants of New Year's Eve celebrations lay scattered like confetti in the gutters, but at the estate, the atmosphere was one of profound, quiet transformation. The Iron King's fortress no longer felt like a prison or a barracks. It had finally begun to feel like a home. Elias stood on the wide stone balcony overlooking the frost-dusted gardens. He was dressed in a simple white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal his scarred forearms, and dark trousers. He looked younger than he had on that rainy October night, when he first saw a photograph of a copper-haired girl. The lines of predatory tension that had once defined his face had softened into something more complex, a mixture of peace and a new, more noble form of strength. He leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to climb over the jagged silhouette of the city he once ruled with fear. His side still ached where the bullet had grazed him on Christmas Eve, but the physical pain was a grounding presence. It was a reminder of the price he had paid to secure this silence. Over the last week, Elias had worked with a frantic, focused energy to dismantle the darkest parts of his empire. With Marcus's help, he had begun the process of transferring his interests into legitimate logistics and shipping companies. The blood money was being laundered through philanthropy and honest trade. He was no longer the man who lived in the shadows. He was the man who was building a bridge back into the light. A soft footfall sounded behind him, and the familiar, intoxicating scent of rose oil filled the air. Elias didn't need to turn to know she was there. He felt the warmth of her presence before she even touched him. Clara stepped up beside him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. She pressed her cheek against his back, her copper hair spilling over his shoulder like liquid fire. She was wearing a dress of soft, cream-colored silk that felt like a whisper against his skin. Since the night at the coal wharf, she had undergone a metamorphosis of her own. The fragility was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable grace. She was no longer the girl in the tower. She was the woman who had stood by a king and helped him find his soul. Elias turned in her arms, his hands coming up to cup her face. He looked into her green eyes, which were now bright and clear, reflecting the morning sun. He felt a surge of love so powerful it made his breath hitch. It was a terrifying, beautiful weight, the realization that his entire world was now contained within the circle of her arms. "Happy New Year, Elias," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic promise. "It's a new world, Clara," he replied, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. "Everything I did, everything I was, it feels like it belongs to a different man. A man I don't recognize anymore." "He's still a part of you," Clara said, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. "The monster protected the man until the man was strong enough to stand on his own. Don't hate him for doing what he had to do to bring you to me." Elias leaned down, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with a profound mutual surrender. The sensuality between them had evolved. It was no longer fueled by desperation or the adrenaline of a looming war. It was a steady, radiating heat, a fire that burned with the certainty of two souls who had seen the worst of each other and chosen to stay anyway. He moved his hands down her back, the silk of her dress smooth beneath his calloused palms, pressing her body flush against his. He could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of her heart, a counterpoint to the city's distant hum. They stood there for a long time, held in the amber light of the new year. Elias thought back to the beginning, to the debt of blood, the cold vows, and the shattering revelation of her innocence. He realized that the greatest victory of his life hadn't been won on the docks or in the alleys. It had been won in the quiet moments of vulnerability, in the sharing of scars, and in the decision to believe in something better than the darkness. "What happens now?" Clara asked, looking out at the city. "Now we live," Elias said, his voice firm and filled with a quiet authority. "We build something real. We make sure that the name Elias stands for more than just fear. We take the letters your mother wrote, and we live the life she wanted for you." He pulled her back into a warm, protective embrace, his chin resting on the top of her head. The loop of their story, which had begun with a transaction and a lie, had closed with a truth that was more powerful than any empire. The gangster had found his redemption, and the innocent girl had found her strength. Together they were a new entity, a union forged in the fires of the London Underground, and tempered by a love that refused to be broken. As the clock in the hallway struck 9, signaling the start of the first day of 1995, Elias felt a sense of completion. The challenges ahead would be real, the transition to legitimacy would be difficult, and the ghosts of his past would always linger in the shadows. But he was no longer afraid. He had a hidden ally, a partner, and a reason to fight for every sunrise. The story of the Iron King and his Copper Queen was just beginning. It was a story of resilience, of justice, and of the incredible, transformative power of a love that blooms even in the darkest soil. As they walked back into the house together, leaving the balcony to the morning sun, the city of London lay before them, no longer a battlefield, but a landscape of infinite possibility. The new dawn had finally arrived, and for Elias and Clara the light was only just beginning to shine.